In the lawless frontier town, where justice bends to the will of cruel men, a widow's desperate cries echo across the morning mist. Accused of witchcraft and shamed for surviving without a man, she's dragged to the icy river by merciless settlers. Water fills her lungs as rough hands force her under until a single gunshot pierces the air, stopping the mob cold. A mysterious cowboy, wealthy beyond measure and feared across counties, storms in with his revolver drawn. He lifts her shivering form from the river, wraps her in his coat, and rides away with her in his arms. By sunrise they return as husband and wife, shocking the town into silence. But what dark secrets from his past drove him to risk everything for a stranger that fateful morning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Wheeler's fingers traced the worn gold band that hung from a leather cord around her neck. Thomas had saved for 3 years to buy it, working extra shifts at the lumber mill until his hands were raw and calloused. A proper ring for a proper lady, he'd said, sliding it onto her finger that spring morning 5 years ago. Now it served as both comfort and curse, a reminder of the life she'd lost, and the solitude that marked her as different in the eyes of River's Edge. Before Thomas, she'd been Miss Sarah Collins, the schoolteacher who'd arrived from Boston with her credentials carefully rolled in her carpet bag and dreams of bringing education to the frontier. The town had welcomed her then, grateful for anyone willing to teach their children more than basic numbers and letters. Mothers would stop by the schoolhouse with fresh-baked bread, and fathers would tip their hats respectfully when she passed. Thomas Wheeler had been the school's handyman, quiet and steady as the seasons. He'd catch her eye while fixing loose floorboards or patching the roof, always finding some reason to work when the children were at their lessons. Sarah would pretend not to notice, but her heart quickened each time his shadow crossed her classroom window. Their courtship had been proper, chaperoned by the minister's wife and approved by the town council. Thomas built them a small house at the edge of town, close enough to the school for Sarah to walk each morning, far enough from the bustle for a garden. They'd planted herbs together, sage, rosemary, thyme, and Sarah had learned their medicinal properties from her grandmother's worn journal, carefully preserved from her childhood. A woman should know how to heal, her grandmother had always said. Nature provides what doctors cannot. Sarah had nodded dutifully then, not knowing how precious that knowledge would become. 3 years of happiness passed like a sweet dream. Thomas's gentle laugh filled their home. His strong hands kept their roof tight and their garden tended. They'd talked of children, of expanding the house, of all the tomorrows stretching before them. But frontier life was as cruel as it was beautiful, and the fever that swept through River's Edge that winter cared nothing for their plans. Sarah had tried everything: cool compresses, herbal teas, poultices from her grandmother's recipes. For 6 days and nights she barely left Thomas's bedside, her prayers mixing with the bitter smell of medicinal herbs. On the 7th morning he'd squeezed her hand one last time, his eyes clear for a moment as he whispered, "You're stronger than you know, my love." The town's sympathy had lasted through the funeral, through the first month of Sarah's widowhood. But as she returned to teaching, as she maintained her home and garden alone, whispers began. A proper widow should remarry, they said, or at least move in with a respectable family. A woman alone wasn't natural. And those herbs she grew, those poultices she made, weren't they just like the ones old Widow Jenkins had used before they'd driven her out for witchcraft? Sarah's fingers tightened around Thomas's ring. She'd removed it from her finger the day they buried him, but couldn't bear to lock it away. Instead, she wore it close to her heart, a talisman against loneliness, and a reminder of the love that had given her the strength to continue. But lately, that strength had drawn suspicious looks, fearful whispers. Even her former friends crossed the street to avoid her, clutching their children closer as they passed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same independence that Thomas had loved in her now marked her as dangerous in the town's eyes. she'd caught. The minister's wife, watching her garden with narrow eyes, had noticed the way parents hesitated before sending their sick children to school. Last week, little Mary Cooper's mother had refused Sarah's offer of fever-reducing tea. Though the girl had been burning up in class, the shadows were lengthening outside her window, and Sarah knew she should light the lamps. But something held her still. Thomas's ring cool against her skin as she watched darkness gather at the edges of her small world. Tomorrow would bring more whispers, more sidelong glances, more pressure to conform to what River's Edge thought a widow should be. But Thomas's last words echoed in her mind, and she straightened her spine. She was stronger than they knew, and she would not let fear drive her from the home she and Thomas had built with love. By candlelight, Sarah carefully recorded the day's observations in her grandmother's journal, her neat script filling the spaces between the old woman's faded notes. "Yarrow poultice, effective for young Tim Baker's wound," she wrote, then paused, remembering how the boy's father had snatched him away when he saw Sarah applying the herbs. She'd tried to explain that yarrow had been used for centuries to stop bleeding, but Mr. Baker had only muttered something about unnatural knowledge. Before hurrying away, the leather-bound journal was as much a record of prejudice as it was of healing. Between recipes for fever teas and notes on wound care, Sarah had begun documenting the town's changing attitude. Each page told two stories, her grandmother's wisdom passed down through generations, and the growing fear that transformed simple herbs into symbols of witchcraft. "Willow bark tea," read her grandmother's flowing script. "Nature's gift for pain and fever." Below it, Sarah had added her own bitter observation. "Mrs. Peterson declined treatment for her arthritis today. Said she'd rather suffer than risk her soul." A knock at the door startled her, sending a drop of ink spattering across the page. Sarah hastily closed the journal, sliding it beneath a stack of schoolbooks. Visitors after dark were rare now and rarely brought good news. Through the window, she caught the gleam of lanterns, multiple lights, multiple visitors. Miss Wheeler, Caroline Foster's voice, usually so friendly during school hours, held an edge Sarah had never heard before. "We know you're home. We need to speak with you." Sarah's hand trembled as she lit a second candle. Caroline was on the school board, and her husband Edward was the town's banker. Their word carried weight in River's Edge. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find not just the Fosters, but Reverend Blake and his wife as well. "We've come about the children," Caroline said, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "There have been concerns. Sarah stepped back, allowing them to enter while keeping the table with her hidden journal between them. "My students' progress has been excellent. Just last week—" "This isn't about their studies," Reverend Blake interrupted. "It's about their souls." He pulled a small object from his pocket, a dried bunch of lavender that Sarah had given to little Emma Blake for her headaches. "My daughter says you've been distributing these charms to the children. It's lavender, Reverend, for headaches and sleep. Surely you remember your own mother using it." "My mother was a God-fearing woman who trusted in prayer and proper medicine." The Reverend's face hardened. "She didn't consort with spirits or corrupt the innocent with pagan remedies." Mrs. Foster stepped forward, her face a mask of false concern. "We're worried about you, Sarah. Living alone, practicing these arts. It's not natural for a woman of your age and station. Edward and I have discussed it, and we'd be willing to let you board with us. Under proper supervision, of course." The offer hung in the air like smoke, suffocating in its implication. Sarah felt Thomas's ring grow heavy against her chest as she straightened her spine. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but I'm quite capable of managing on my own." "That's exactly the kind of pride that leads to damnation," Mrs. Blake hissed. "First it's herbs and potions, then before you know it, she'll be dancing with the devil himself." "I heal with God's own plants," Sarah protested. But she could see her words falling on deaf ears. The visitors' shadows loomed large on her walls, distorted by candlelight into monstrous shapes. "You have until Sunday to make your decision." Reverend Blake pronounced. "Either accept the Fosters' Christian charity, or we'll be forced to take more decisive action to protect our community." After they left, Sarah sank into her chair, hands shaking as she retrieved her grandmother's journal. She should burn it. She knew. Burn it and accept the Fosters' offer, bow her head, and let them break her spirit in the name of saving her soul. But as she touched the worn leather cover, she remembered her grandmother's words. "Knowledge isn't evil, child. Fear is, and those who give in to fear will always find something to fear." By candlelight, Sarah made a new entry. "Tonight they tried to take my freedom in the name of salvation. But I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and I will not let fear, theirs or mine, destroy what generations of wise women have preserved. God help me, I will stand my ground." James Crawford checked his silver pocket watch, a fine Swiss timepiece that had accompanied him through 15 years of building his cattle empire. 6:43 in the morning. The sun wouldn't crest the hills for another 17 minutes. But already, River's Edge was stirring, smoke rising from chimneys against the pearl-grey sky. He'd timed his arrival deliberately, early enough to observe the town unnoticed, late enough to conduct business once the bank opened. From his vantage point on the ridge overlooking the settlement, he cut an imposing figure atop his black stallion. His clothes, though trail-worn, were of fine quality: Eastern-cut jacket, pressed shirt, boots that had never seen farm labor. The watch chain across his vest gleamed dully, its weight a constant reminder of time's passage and the precision with which he'd built his life. At 45, James Crawford was known across 3 territories as a man who didn't waste time. His, nor others. He'd arrived in the West with nothing but ambition and an uncanny head for numbers, parlaying a single cattle drive into a sprawling ranch empire. Now, with 30,000 head of cattle and more than 100 men in his employ, he was here to acquire the last piece of his expansion plans. River's Edge's struggling bank. The town below matched the reports he'd received. A single main street. Perhaps 40 buildings of varying quality, the church spire standing proud against the mountains beyond. What his reports hadn't mentioned was the tension visible even from this distance. The way people hurried rather than walked, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting trouble. James flipped open his watch again. 6:48, in the growing light. He could make out more details. A woman walking quickly along the street's edge, her shawl pulled tight. Something about her bearing caught his attention. Straight-backed, despite her obvious desire to avoid notice, dignity in every step. As she passed beneath his position, a gust of wind caught her shawl, revealing dark hair threaded with silver and a face that spoke of quiet determination. He found himself checking his watch again, marking the exact moment she disappeared into what appeared to be a small schoolhouse. 6:51. James Crawford didn't believe in coincidences or fate, but he believed in patterns, in the way time revealed truth to those patient enough to observe. "Mr. Crawford?" His foreman, Michael Brady, rode up quietly. "Bank opens at 7. Town's already talking about your arrival." James nodded, unsurprised. News traveled fast in small towns, and his reputation preceded him. Some called him ruthless, others fair but hard. All agreed he was a man whose word, once given, was as precise and unchanging as the watch he carried. "What else have you learned?" he asked, knowing Brady would have spent the night in the town's only saloon, gathering information. "Town's got rot in it, sir. Not the usual kind, not outlaws or corruption. Something worse, fear. They're turning on their own." James raised an eyebrow, inviting elaboration. "Widow been teaching here 5 years or so. Respected until her husband, who died. Now they're calling her witch because she won't remarry or give up her independence. Been helping folks with herbs and such, traditional healing. Church folks don't like it. Banker's wife's leading the charge against her. The woman with the straight spine and quick steps." James checked his watch again. 6:57. "The banker, Foster, he's the one selling." "Yes, sir. Claims it's about retirement, but word is he's using the bank to squeeze folks he doesn't like, especially the widow. Called in her mortgage last week, though she's never missed a payment. James closed his watch with a decisive click. He'd built his empire on numbers, yes, but also on understanding human nature. Fear could corrupt a town faster than any outlaw, and corruption meant opportunity, for good or ill, depending on the man wielding it. "Time to meet Mr. Foster," he said, turning his horse toward the path into town. The watch rode heavy in his pocket, marking each hoofbeat as they descended. 6:59. In his experience, the most important moments often came down to precise timing and careful observation. The townspeople stopped to stare as he rode past, conversations dying mid-word. His black coat and hat, the silver watch chain, the way he sat his horse, everything marked him as a man accustomed to power. But it was his eyes, sharp and assessing, that made them look away first. Here was a man who saw too much, who measured, and judged with the same precision as the timepiece he carried. 7 o'clock struck as he dismounted in front of the bank, right on time, as always. But for the first time in years, James Crawford had a feeling that his carefully planned business trip was about to become something far more complicated and far more important than a simple bank purchase. The parchment trembled in Sarah's hands as she read the formal accusations. The letter bore the signatures of River's Edge's most prominent citizens, their neat penmanship spelling out her doom in careful, measured words. To Mrs. Sarah Wheeler, being a widow of River's Edge Township, it began with false courtesy. In light of numerous accusations of unwholesome practices and suspicious behaviors unbecoming to a Christian woman, you are hereby summoned to appear before the town council tomorrow at dawn to answer for the following charges. The list that followed turned her stomach: practicing witchcraft, corrupting the youth, communing with dark spirits, even causing the illness of Martha Stone's prized cow, though Sarah had never been near the animal. But it was the final charge that struck deepest: willful defiance of God's natural order through continued refusal to accept proper guidance and protection from a suitable male guardian. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the window, she saw Edward Foster's broad frame, his banker's coat pristine in the afternoon light. Sarah quickly folded the letter and squared her shoulders before opening the door. "Mrs. Wheeler," Foster's voice dripped false concern. "I trust you've received the council's notice. I've come to offer you one last chance at redemption." "How generous," Sarah said quietly, though her heart pounded. She noticed James Crawford's imposing figure across the street, watching the exchange with sharp eyes from the shade of the general store's awning. Something about his presence gave her courage. "The bank is prepared to forgive your mortgage," Foster continued, "provided you accept the council's guidance. Mrs. Foster would welcome you into our home. Under proper supervision, of course, you could continue teaching, though naturally not those alternative practices of yours." Sarah's fingers found Thomas's ring beneath her collar. "My mortgage payments have never been late, Mr. Foster, and my practices, as you call them, are nothing more than the knowledge my grandmother passed down. Knowledge that saved your own son's life last winter, if you'll recall." Foster's face hardened. "That's precisely the kind of pride and insolence that condemns you, woman. Perhaps a night of prayer and contemplation will soften your heart. Remember, dawn tomorrow. The council will expect your full submission and repentance." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Wheeler, do be prompt. Some members of the council have suggested more immediate measures should you fail to appear or prove intractable." After he left, Sarah sank into her chair, the accusation letter heavy in her lap. Through the window, she saw James Crawford still watching, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, checking what appeared to be a silver pocket watch. She unfolded the letter again, studying the signatures. Names she'd known for years, people whose children she'd taught, whose illnesses she'd treated, whose friendship she'd once valued. Now they'd turned against her, their fears and prejudices twisting simple healing into something dark and dangerous. The sun was setting, painting her small home in shadows. Tomorrow at dawn, she would face their accusations. They would demand she surrender her independence, her knowledge, her very identity. They would try to break her spirit in the name of saving her soul. Sarah stood and moved to her herb cabinet, running her fingers over the dried plants that had become her supposed instruments of evil. Lavender for headaches, willow bark for fever, yarrow for wounds, God's own creations turned sinister by fear and ignorance. The accusation letter lay on her table, its official seal gleaming in the fading light. Tomorrow would bring either submission or condemnation. But as darkness fell over River's Edge, Sarah Wheeler made her choice. She would not surrender the truth to appease their fears. Whatever the cost, she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through widowhood. She didn't know it yet, but that decision would set in motion events that would change not only her fate, but the very heart of River's Edge itself. Dawn came with heavy fog, rolling off the river, thick enough to blur the shapes of the men who surrounded Sarah's house. She clutched her shawl tighter, the soft blue one Thomas had given her for their last Christmas together, as angry fists pounded on her door. "Come out, witch!" Reverend Blake's voice carried authority even through wooden walls. "Face God's judgment!" Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched Thomas's ring one last time. She had known they wouldn't wait for the council meeting, had sensed the mob's intentions in the night's restless sounds. Now, watching shadows move through the mist, she squared her shoulders and opened the door. They seized her before she could speak. Rough hands, belonging to men whose children she had taught, whose wives she had helped through difficult births. Her shawl caught on someone's grip and tore as they dragged her toward the river. The fog transformed familiar faces into grotesque masks. Mrs. Foster stood at the front of the crowd, her proper silk dress incongruous in the grey morning. "See how she shows no fear. Only a witch would be so brazen." The river came too quickly, its dark water churning with spring melt. Sarah's feet slipped on wet rocks as they forced her forward. The icy water first touched her ankles, then her knees, stealing her breath. "Confess!" Reverend Blake's command cut through the morning air. "Renounce your evil ways and submit to proper authority." Sarah felt the current tugging at her skirts. "I've done nothing wrong," she managed through chattering teeth. "Everything I know comes from God's own creation." The first dunking cut off her words. The river closed over her head, cold enough to steal thought. They held her under until spots danced behind her eyes, then yanked her up. Her shawl floated away, a pale blue ghost in the murky water. "Admit your sins." Mrs. Foster's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Accept Christian charity and guidance." "No." Sarah tasted river water and blood. She'd bitten her lip coming up. "I won't trade truth for fear." This time they held her longer. The river roared in her ears, hungry for another victim. Sarah thought of Thomas, of her grandmother, of all the strong women who had passed down their knowledge through generations. As her lungs screamed for air, she felt almost peaceful. She would not break. They could take her life, but not her dignity. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Suddenly the hands holding her disappeared. Sarah broke the surface, gasping, to find the morning transformed. A man on a black horse had ridden into the river itself, his silver watch chain glinting as he held a smoking revolver skyward. "Step back." James Crawford's voice carried the weight of mountains. "Anyone who touches her answers to me." The mob wavered. Crawford's reputation was well known. A man who had built an empire through iron will and unflinching resolve. His gun lowered, pointing at Reverend Blake. "This is not your concern, Mr. Crawford," Foster began. "This is a matter of..." "Of what?" Crawford's words cut like steel. "Of brave men drowning a woman who dares to live by her own strength? Of cowards, hiding their greed behind false piety." His horse moved forward, scattering the closest members of the mob. "I've spent the night reviewing your bank's records, Foster. Shall we discuss the real corruption in River's Edge?" In the sudden silence, Sarah felt the current trying to pull her under again. Then Crawford was beside her, strong hands lifting her onto his horse. Her soaked clothes dripped river water, but his coat settled warm around her shoulders. "Hold tight," he murmured, and she clutched his vest as they turned toward the shore. The crowd parted silently, faces now showing shame or fear rather than righteous anger. Her blue shawl surfaced briefly downstream, then disappeared beneath the dark water like the life she had known, washed away in the space of a morning. The marriage certificate lay on Judge Matthew's desk, its official embossing catching the early morning light. Sarah, still wearing Crawford's coat over her damp dress, stared at the blank lines awaiting their signatures. Everything had happened so quickly. The ride to the judge's house, Crawford's quiet but firm insistence on immediate action, the judge's bleary-eyed compliance when faced with the wealthiest rancher in 3 territories. "It's the surest protection I can offer," Crawford had explained during the swift ride from the river, "unless you'd prefer to leave River's Edge entirely." When she'd shaken her head, unable to abandon her home and the memories it held, he'd simply nodded. "Then we'll make this legal and binding. No one will dare touch a Crawford." Now, watching the judge's trembling hands prepare the document, Sarah felt oddly detached from the proceedings. Her grandmother's ring still hung heavy and cold against her chest, while Crawford's silver watch ticked away the seconds from his vest pocket. Time, measuring the space between her old life and whatever this new one would become. "I, James Crawford, do take—" The words blurred together as Crawford spoke them, his voice steady and sure. Sarah heard herself respond, the traditional phrases falling from numb lips. The judge's pen scratched across paper, recording the union. For posterity, Mrs. Crawford. The name sounded foreign to her ears. James, she supposed she should think of him as James now, helped her to her feet. "The carriage will take us to the ranch. We can send for your belongings later." Through the judge's window, Sarah could see townspeople gathering in the square, drawn by the news spreading like wildfire. The same people who had tried to drown her just hours ago now watched in stunned silence as James Crawford, the most powerful man to ever take interest in their small town, led his new bride to a waiting carriage. "You're safe now," he murmured, helping her up. "And you'll stay that way." The carriage ride passed in contemplative quiet. Sarah watched the familiar streets of River's Edge fall away, replaced by open country. Beside her, Crawford, James, maintained a respectful distance, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from river water. He considered the question carefully, checking his watch before answering. "I've spent my life building something from nothing, watching men try to tear down what others build, usually out of fear or greed." His eyes met hers. "What?" "They tried to destroy in you this morning. Independence, strength, dignity. Those are worth protecting." The carriage crested a hill, revealing a sprawling ranch house nestled against distant mountains. White-painted fences stretched to the horizon, enclosing vast herds of cattle. This was Crawford's empire, built through the same precise determination she'd witnessed this morning. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch," he said quietly. "You're home now if you choose to make it so." The carriage rolled to a stop before the main house. A handful of ranch hands paused in their morning work, trying not to stare too openly at their boss's unexpected bride. Sarah noticed how they straightened unconsciously when Crawford stepped down. Respect rather than fear in their demeanor. Inside, the house surprised her. She'd expected bachelor sparseness, but found well-worn comfort instead. Books lined study walls, landscape paintings brightened corridors, and through an open door she glimpsed an herb garden that put her own modest plot to shame. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, maintains it," James explained, following her gaze. "She has quite a knowledge of traditional medicine herself, Chinese remedies passed down through her family." His slight smile suggested he'd known exactly what he was revealing. "Perhaps you two will have much to discuss." A small, dignified Chinese woman appeared as if summoned, taking in Sarah's bedraggled appearance with calm efficiency. "Bath is ready, Mr. Crawford, and I've laid out some clean clothes that should fit Mrs. Crawford for now." Sarah felt tears, threatening for the first time since the river. This practical kindness, after the morning's horror, nearly undid her composure. James seemed to sense it, stepping back with quiet understanding. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "We can discuss arrangements later. For now, know that you're safe here and free to make your own choices." As Mrs. Chen led her upstairs, Sarah caught a glimpse of the marriage certificate tucked carefully in James's coat pocket. A simple document that had transformed her from condemned witch to protected wife in the space of an hour. But looking at James Crawford's retreating figure, she wondered if perhaps she'd found something more valuable than mere protection, an ally who understood the true worth of independence. In James's study, the leather-bound ranch ledger lay open on a massive oak desk, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and notations. Sarah ran her finger down a single page, eyes widening at the figures. 1 week's cattle sales exceeded what River's Edge's bank handled in a year. But it wasn't just livestock. There were investments in railroads, silver mines, and vast tracts of land across 3 territories. "Trying to understand your new domain," James's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, his usual formal attire, replaced by simpler ranch wear, though his silver watch chain still gleamed at his vest. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" Sarah began to close the ledger, but he waved away her concern. "It's your right to know what you've married into." He crossed to the desk, standing close enough that she caught the scent of leather and morning air. "Though I suspect you're more interested in this." He opened a drawer and withdrew a familiar document. Edward Foster's bank ledger. "You mentioned corruption at the river," she said carefully. "What did you find?" "Foster's been using the bank to squeeze out anyone who doesn't fit his vision of proper society." James's voice held controlled anger. "Calling in loans without cause, denying credit to those who question the church's authority. Your mortgage wasn't the only one he's weaponized." Sarah thought of other families who'd left River's Edge suddenly, their departures marked by whispered rumors and quick property sales. "And now you own the bank, as of this morning." He smiled slightly. "Foster was quite eager to sell once. I presented evidence of his creative bookkeeping. The council will be receiving some interesting documentation about their spiritual leaders' financial practices." A knock at the study door revealed Mrs. Chen with a tea tray. The housekeeper set it down with practiced grace, then hesitated. "Pardon, but Cook wants to know Mrs. Crawford's preferences for dinner." Sarah startled at the name. She still wasn't used to it. "Oh, I wouldn't want to disrupt your usual routine." "The routine could use disrupting," James said quietly. "This house has been—" He checked his watch, a gesture Sarah was beginning to recognize as a habit when choosing his words carefully. "Too ordered, too precise." Mrs. Chen's usual stoic expression softened slightly. "Perhaps Mrs. Crawford would like to see the herb garden properly? Some fresh sage would complement tonight's roast." The suggestion hung in the air like an offering. Sarah glanced at James, who nodded encouragement. "I'd like that very much." As she followed Mrs. Chen out, Sarah heard James adding figures in the ledger, his pen scratching across paper with practiced efficiency. The sound followed her through the house's wide corridors, a reminder of the precise mind that had built this empire. The herb garden was a revelation. Neat beds stretched behind the house, traditional European herbs mingling with Chinese medicinal plants Sarah had only read about. Mrs. Chen named each one in both English and Chinese, explaining their properties with the quiet authority of generations. "Of knowledge. Mr. Crawford had these beds planted 5 years ago," she said, crushing a sage leaf to release its scent. "Said a proper ranch should be self-sufficient in healing. The men get hurt sometimes working cattle. Better to have remedies close at hand." Sarah absorbed this new detail about her husband. He respects traditional medicine. Mr. Crawford respects what works. Mrs. Chen's dark eyes held wisdom. He built all this watching and learning, seeing what others missed, like noticing a strong woman being broken by small minds. From the garden, Sarah could see ranch hands at work in the distance, They moved with purpose but without fear, calling greetings as James walked among them, checking fences and stock. A rider approached him with some concern, pointing to a distant hill. James consulted his watch, gave what appeared to be precise instructions, and the rider galloped off with newfound confidence. "The men would die for him," Mrs. Chen said. "Simply, not because he demands it, because he sees their worth and gives them room to prove it." Sarah thought of the ledger's neat columns, the careful documentation of an empire built on attention to detail and respect for what others overlooked. She thought of James's quiet anger at Foster's abuse of power, his immediate understanding of what she faced in River's Edge. "There," Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction, pressing a bundle of fresh herbs into Sarah's hands. "Now you can show Cook your own knowledge. This house has been waiting for a woman's touch, one that understands both strength and healing." The photograph fell from between the pages of an old ledger as Sarah organized the study's bookshelf. Sepia-toned and slightly faded, it captured a moment frozen in time. A younger James Crawford standing beside a beautiful dark-haired woman who held a small girl in her arms. Their faces glowed with happiness, unaware of whatever tragedy had turned this scene into a painful memory. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. She'd wondered about the careful way James maintained his solitude, the precise routines that seemed to guard against something deeper than mere habit. Now, looking at the joy in his younger face, she began to understand. "Margaret and Emily." James's voice came from the doorway, startling her. He stood watching, his expression carefully controlled, one hand automatically reaching for his silver watch. "My wife and daughter. 15 years ago. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." Sarah began to return the photograph, but he crossed the room and gently took it from her hands, studying it with a mix of pain and tenderness. "Cholera," he said quietly. "It swept through our settlement before we had the ranch. I was away on a cattle drive. By the time I returned," his voice trailed off as he traced the outline of his daughter's face with one finger. Emily was 4. Margaret had just taught her to read. Sarah thought of her own loss, of Thomas's fever, and her desperate attempts to save him. "That's why you built the herb garden, why you respect traditional medicine." James nodded, his eyes still on the photograph. "Margaret believed in healing with nature's remedies. She'd learned from her grandmother like you. When I returned to find them gone, to hear how they'd suffered while the town's doctor was too far away to help." He checked his watch, a gesture Sarah now recognized as self-control rather than timekeeping. "I swore no one under my protection would ever lack for healing again." "The Chinese herbs in the garden," Sarah said softly. "Mrs. Chen's knowledge. I spent 2 years traveling after I lost them. Learned what I could about different healing traditions. Built this place with the idea that it would be more than just a ranch, a sanctuary where knowledge was respected, not feared." His laugh held a bitter edge. "Though I never expected to find someone who needed that sanctuary quite so dramatically." Sarah touched Thomas's ring through her dress, understanding flowing between them. "This morning, at the river, you saw more than just a woman being persecuted. I saw fear destroying wisdom." Again, James finally looked up from the photograph, his eyes meeting hers. "When I arrived in River's Edge, I planned to buy the bank, expose Foster's corruption, and move on. But then I saw you walking to the schoolhouse, head high despite their whispers. Saw your strength in the face of their fear. You reminded me of Margaret." He crossed to his desk, opening a drawer Sarah hadn't explored. Inside lay a small wooden box, beautifully carved. "Margaret's medicine kit," he explained, lifting the lid to reveal dried herbs, small bottles, and carefully written recipes. "I've kept it, though I barely understand its contents. Perhaps—" He hesitated, then held out the box. "Perhaps it belongs with someone who can use it properly." Sarah accepted the box with trembling hands, recognizing the precious gift of trust it represented. Inside, she found remedies similar to her grandmother's, some in Margaret's careful handwriting, others in Chinese characters she assumed were from Mrs. Chen's contributions. "James," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Thank you. Not just for this morning, but for understanding, for creating a place where knowledge isn't something to fear." He reached out slowly, touching Thomas's ring where it hung against her collar. "We've both lost love to death's cruel timing. Perhaps," he checked his watch again, but this time with a slight smile, "perhaps it's time to create something new." From those losses, through the study window, Sarah could see Mrs. Chen in the herb garden, harvesting plants for the evening's remedies. Ranch hands moved across distant pastures, secure in their work and worth. This was what James had built from his grief, not just an empire of cattle and land, but a haven where different kinds of knowledge and strength could flourish. "I'd like that," she said, carefully returning the photograph to its ledger, "to help build something new." James's hand found hers, warm and strong, as they stood together in the study where two kinds of grief had met and recognized each other. Outside, the sun was setting over Silver Creek Ranch, painting the world in shades of hope and possibility. Sarah found the letter on her pillow one evening, a week after the photograph's discovery. The paper was fine linen, the handwriting as precise as James's ledger entries, but softened somehow, more personal than his business hand. She sat on the edge of her bed, in the guest room he'd insisted she take for her own, and began to read. "My dear Sarah, there are things easier written than spoken, especially for a man who has spent 15 years hiding his heart behind pocket watches and precise numbers. Today I watched you in the herb garden with Mrs. Chen, teaching young Billy how to wrap his sprained wrist with yarrow poultices. The boy who usually flinches from any touch sat still under your care, trust in his eyes. It reminded me of Margaret. With Emily, that same gentle strength, but you're not Margaret, and I'm not Thomas. We're something new, born from the ashes of old grief. When I rode into River's Edge, I thought I was there to right a financial wrong. Instead, I found myself watching you walk down that street, head high despite their whispers, and something, long dormant, stirred in my chest. I built this ranch on careful observation, on seeing what others miss. So let me tell you what I see in you. Not just the strength that faced down a mob, but the wisdom that knows when to be gentle. Not just the healer who saves bodies, but the teacher who touches souls. You've brought something to Silver Creek that all my careful planning couldn't provide. A heart. I check my watch less when you're near. Time feels different, less like a master to appease, and more like a friend carrying us forward. If you're willing, I'd like to explore this new territory together, not as a marriage of convenience, but as a true partnership. Take all the time you need to consider. Whatever you decide, know that Silver Creek will always be your sanctuary, yours. Sincerely, James. Sarah pressed the letter to her chest, feeling her own heart beat against the paper. Through her window, she could see James in the courtyard below, discussing something with his foreman. Even at this distance, she recognized the familiar gesture of checking his watch, but now she understood it differently, not as a businessman's habit, but as a widower's shield against unpredictable emotions. She crossed to her writing desk, took out her own paper, and began to write by lamplight. "Dear James, your letter found me at sunset, when the light turns the mountains the color of Thomas's. Copper wedding ring. I've worn his ring around my neck these past years, like a shield of my own, protecting my heart from a world that seemed to have no place for a woman's independence. But tonight, I find myself touching it less, looking instead toward the future you offer. You say you see me clearly. Let me tell you what I see in you. A man who built not just an empire, but a haven for healing and knowledge, who faces corruption not with matching cruelty, but with quiet justice, who understands that true strength lies in protecting others' right to be themselves. No, I'm not Margaret, and you're not Thomas. where something unexpected and new, like the Chinese herbs flourishing alongside European sage in your garden, different traditions finding harmony, stronger together than apart. You gave me sanctuary when I needed it most. But more than that, you gave me understanding. You saw me not as someone to be controlled or changed, but as someone whose differences could add to the tapestry you've woven here at Silver Creek. Time feels different for me too now. Less like a burden of memories, more like a path opening before us. I would very much like to walk it together. Yours truly, Sarah. She sealed the letter and walked downstairs, out into the courtyard where James still stood, silver watch gleaming in the last light. He turned at her approach, and she held out her letter without speaking. As he read, she watched his face soften in the gathering dusk. When he finished, he carefully folded both letters together and reached for his watch. But instead of checking it, he unclipped the chain and held it out to her. Perhaps it's time to trust in something less precise than minutes and hours. Sarah touched Thomas's ring, then slowly lifted its cord from around her neck. They stood in the deepening twilight, each holding a symbol of their past lives. Then, as naturally as sunrise, they exchanged them, his watch settling against her heart, her ring warming in his palm. "Time for something new," she whispered, and stepped into his waiting arms. The note arrived with the morning supply wagon from River's Edge, wrapped around a stone and thrust into a sack of flour. Mrs. Chen discovered it while preparing breakfast, her usual calm demeanor cracking slightly as she handed the dirty paper. To Sarah, "Witchcraft and wealth won't protect you forever. God's judgment reaches even to Silver Creek. Repent before it's too late." The words were cut from newspaper print and pasted in uneven rows, but Sarah recognized the biblical quotation. Scrawled at the bottom in familiar handwriting, Reverend Blake's favorite verse about suffering God's wrath. She was studying it in the morning light when James entered the kitchen, immediately noting her tension. "What is it?" He moved to read over her shoulder, one hand settling protectively at her waist, while the other reached for the watch she now wore. The silver case was warm against her chest, a constant reminder of their growing connection. "They're not finished with me," Sarah said quietly, "or with us." She handed him the note, watching his face harden as he read. "That's Reverend Blake's writing at the bottom." The good Reverend seems to have forgotten his own precarious position. James's voice was carefully controlled. "Foster's ledgers revealed. Quite interesting payments to the church building fund, payments that coincided with several families being driven from their homes." Mrs. Chen set a cup of her special calming tea beside Sarah. "Ranch hands reported strangers watching the property last night. Miguel saw them near the south pasture." James nodded, unsurprised. "I've doubled the patrols. No one approaches Silver Creek without our knowledge." He touched Thomas's ring, now hanging from his own watch chain. "But we need to do more than just defend. It's time to show River's Edge that their old tactics won't work anymore." Sarah sipped her tea, thinking of the families who'd fled before her, of the power fear had held over the town for so long. "The bank records, you said they showed a pattern of systematic persecution." "Yes. Foster and Blake worked together, targeting anyone who questioned their authority. First the rumors would start, then the bank would call in loans or deny credit. The church would follow with accusations of moral failings." His lip curled slightly, "a convenient partnership of financial and spiritual pressure. Then we fight them with truth," Sarah said firmly. "Not just for us, but for everyone they've driven away." She touched the watch at her throat, drawing strength from its steady ticking. "I still have my grandmother's journal, documenting every treatment, every healing. And now Margaret's medical kit, showing the same remedies from a different tradition. Proof that what they call witchcraft is just knowledge passed down through generations." James studied her with quiet pride. "Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to add your family's records to this documentation? 3 traditions showing the same healing wisdom?" The housekeeper straightened. "My grandmother's scrolls are very old, very respected in San Francisco. I will send for them." "Good." James spread the threatening note on the table. "Let them come." To Silver Creek, they'll find more than just a witch and her wealthy protector. They'll find centuries of healing wisdom gathered in one place, and witnesses to their own corruption ready to speak out. Sarah thought of her small classroom in River's Edge, of the children who'd loved learning until fear taught them to suspect. Knowledge. The school records too, she said slowly. I kept detailed notes on every child's progress, including those who suddenly disappeared when their parents faced mysterious financial troubles. A pattern of persecution documented from every angle. James smiled grimly. While they're watching our fences, we'll be building a different kind of defense. Mrs. Chen gathered the breakfast dishes with deliberate calm. I will tell Cook to expect more visitors soon. Important visitors from the territorial capital, perhaps? Yes, James confirmed. I've already sent letters to certain officials who take a very dim view of bank fraud and civil rights violations. River's Edge is about to discover that isolation doesn't equal immunity. Sarah stood, squaring her shoulders. I should check the herb garden. If trouble's coming, we'll need to be prepared with healing remedies. We face this together, James said quietly, catching her hand. They thought to frighten us with this note. Instead, they've given us the catalyst to act. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see ranch hands going about their morning duties, their presence a reminder of the community that had embraced her. Silver Creek wasn't just a sanctuary anymore. It was a gathering point for different kinds of strength, different traditions of wisdom. Let River's Edge send their threats. This time, fear would meet its match in truth. Sheriff Wilson's badge caught the afternoon sun as he dismounted in Silver Creek's courtyard, its tarnished surface matching the worn ethics of its bearer. 4 deputies flanked him, hands resting too casually on their holsters. James stood on the ranch house porch, watching their approach with the same careful attention he gave to studying his ledgers. Mr. Crawford, the sheriff called, voice carrying false heartiness, got some legal matters to discuss. Sarah stepped up beside James, feeling the steady tick of his watch against her chest. She'd known Wilson for years, had taught his youngest, her daughter, until the girl mysteriously stopped attending school last winter. Now she recognized the slight flush on his face, the way his badge sat crooked on his vest, signs of a man trying to convince himself he served justice while knowing better. Legal matters regarding what, Sheriff? James's tone was perfectly measured, but Sarah felt the tension in his stance. Wilson pulled a document from his coat. Got a warrant here, signed by Judge Matthews himself. Seems there's concerns about illegal practices at Silver Creek. Unauthorized medical treatments, harboring a known. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah, a person of suspicious character. Suspicious character? Sarah's quiet question made the sheriff shift uncomfortably. Like Mary Wilson. How is your daughter's fever, Sheriff? The one the town doctor couldn't cure? A flash of shame crossed Wilson's face. He'd come to her in secret 2 months ago, desperate for the herbal remedies he now condemned. His daughter had recovered within days. Now, Mrs. Crawford, he began, but James cut him off. Let's be clear about what's really happening here. James descended the porch steps with deliberate calm. Judge Matthews signed that warrant after the bank called in his mortgage, just like he signed my marriage certificate when presented with evidence of his creative loan payments. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. James continued, each word precise as pocket watch gears. You're here because Reverend Blake promised to handle those gambling debts you've been hiding from your wife, the same way he handled Frank Miller's debts before running him out of town. Wilson's hand trembled as he touched his badge. You're interfering with a lawful investigation. No, James's voice hardened. I'm exposing an unlawful conspiracy, one that's about to become very public. He nodded toward the house, where Mrs. Chen had appeared with a stack of documents. Bank records, church accounts, property transfers, and sworn statements from families. Across 3 territories, all ready for the territorial governor's review. The governor, one of the deputies spoke up, sounding worried, arriving tomorrow. James smiled slightly. Along with federal banking investigators and several newspaper editors, quite interested in how a small-town bank and church managed to acquire so much property from suspicious characters who coincidentally faced moral accusations. Sarah watched. The sheriff's face as understanding dawned. His badge, symbol of authority and justice, now seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. She thought of his daughter, of all the children who'd suffered while their parents bowed to corruption, disguised as moral authority. "It's not too late, Sheriff," she said softly. "For any of us. Your daughter still needs medicine sometimes. So do others in River's Edge. We could build something better than fear. The choice is yours," James added. "Stand with Blake and Foster, face federal investigation, or help us end this cycle of persecution." Wilson looked at his deputies, then back at his warrant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man confronting long-buried truth. "My Caroline. She still asks about you, Mrs. Crawford. Misses your teaching. And that tea you gave her." He touched his badge again, then slowly unpinned it. "Maybe it's time someone wore this with honor again." "The territorial marshal will need local deputies who understand the community," James observed quietly. "Men who choose justice over corruption." The sheriff laid his badge on the porch steps, years of tarnish dulling its surface. "Tell me what you need." Inside the house, Sarah heard Mrs. Chen beginning preparations for more guests. The Chinese housekeeper had already arranged rooms for the governor's party, placing Margaret's medical kit, Sarah's grandmother's journal, and her own family scrolls in the study for examination. 3 traditions of healing wisdom, ready to stand against generations of fear. James's hand found hers, warm and strong. Together they watched Wilson gather his deputies, beginning the slow work of rebuilding trust. The badge lay where he'd placed it, afternoon sun touching it like a promise of renewal. "It's starting," Sarah murmured. "Real change." "Yes." James touched Thomas's ring where it hung beside his watch chain. "Built on truth this time, not fear." From the herb garden came the scent of healing plants, carried on a wind that whispered of transformation. Silver Creek stood ready, a beacon of hope against gathering storms. Tomorrow would bring the governor, investigations, and the chance to reshape River's Edge's future. But today, watching the sheriff choose truth over corruption, Sarah felt the first real stirring of victory. The will lay hidden between the pages of an old property deed, its yellowed edges protruding slightly from the leather folder Sarah was organizing before the governor's arrival. As she eased it free, her heart stopped at the date. Just 3 days before James had rescued her from the river. "Last will and testament of James Crawford," she read, then froze at the next lines. "Being of sound mind, I hereby bequeath all properties and holdings to Sarah Wheeler of River's Edge. Should she consent to marriage and maintain the healing traditions established at Silver Creek Ranch." The watch at her throat seemed suddenly heavy, its ticking loud in the quiet study. James had known about her before that morning at the river, had planned to offer marriage even before her persecution reached its peak. "Sarah?" His voice from the doorway made her start. He saw the document in her hands, and something flickered across his face. Concern, guilt, fear of misunderstanding. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long were you watching me before that morning?" James crossed to his desk, his movements careful as if approaching a startled deer. "I arrived in River's Edge 2 weeks before, to investigate the bank, yes, but also—" He touched Thomas's ring on his chain. "Also because I'd heard about a widow who practiced healing arts, who taught children while tending to the sick, who reminded people of someone I'd lost. So it wasn't spontaneous," Sarah's voice trembled, "saving me that morning. You'd already planned to offer marriage. The will was my contingency." He spoke slowly, choosing each word with visible care. "I saw what was happening in River's Edge, saw Foster and Blake tightening their noose. I thought—" He checked himself, started again. "I feared you'd be driven out like the others. Or worse. I wanted to ensure you'd have protection, a place where your knowledge would be valued. through marriage. The word tasted bitter now. A business arrangement. At first, James stepped closer, and she could see the struggle in his eyes. But, Sarah, what I didn't plan for, couldn't plan for, was you. Your strength that morning at the river, your dignity in the face of hatred, the way you've brought life and warmth back to Silver Creek. She touched the watch, remembering the night he'd given it to her. And now, is this still a business arrangement? Look, at the will again, he said softly. The date of the signature. She did, then frowned. The date she'd first seen was crossed out. Below it was another, written just 1 day ago. Reading further, her breath caught. The new version left everything jointly to my wife, Sarah Crawford, whose wisdom and strength have made Silver Creek not just a sanctuary, but a home. I had Michael witness the change yesterday, James said, because this isn't about protecting you anymore. It's about building something together. He reached for her hand. Yes, I plan to offer you sanctuary, but I never planned on falling in love. Sarah looked up at him, seeing not the calculating businessman who'd crafted contingency plans, but the man who checked his watch less often when she was near, who'd given her his most precious memories in Margaret's medical kit, who'd stood beside her against sheriff and town alike. When did you know, she whispered, that it had become more? The moment you found Margaret's photograph, his voice roughened, when you understood about the herb garden, about wanting to protect healing knowledge, when you saw me, not just my wealth or power. He touched the watch at her throat. Time. Measures change, Sarah. I thought I was offering you safety. Instead, you offered me redemption. She looked down at the will, evidence of both calculation and transformation. Like the garden outside, where European herbs now twined with Chinese remedies, their story had grown into something richer than its planned beginnings. Perhaps, she said carefully, we both found more than we expected. James drew her close, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heart matching the watch's quiet ticking. Outside, horses approached, the governor's party arriving. Soon they would face River's Edge's corruption together. But for now, in the study where both truth and love had been revealed, they held each other, stronger for knowing how far they'd come from careful plans to deep devotion. The governor's visit had brought an unexpected gift, a package from one of the families who'd fled River's Edge years ago, now living in the territorial capital. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, Sarah found her grandmother's silver locket, lost during her childhood and thought gone forever. It was pawned to my father's shop, the accompanying letter explained. When I heard the governor was investigating River's Edge, I knew it had to return home. Open it, Mrs. Crawford. The truth was always there. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked the delicate catch. James stood beside her in the study, the morning sun catching both his watch at her throat and Thomas's ring on his chain. Mrs. Chen paused in arranging documents for the investigation, her wise eyes watching with quiet anticipation. The locket's hidden compartment revealed its treasure, a carefully folded paper, brown with age, but still legible. As Sarah unfolded it, her breath caught. There, in elaborate script, was an official certification from the Boston Medical Society, dated 1823. In recognition of Hannah Collins' valuable contributions to frontier medicine and the documentation of traditional healing practices. Your grandmother, James said softly, reading over her shoulder, she wasn't just practicing folk remedies. She was a recognized healer. Sarah's voice shook with wonder. The society commissioned her to document traditional treatments. All those remedies in her journal, they weren't witchcraft, they were medical research. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, gently touching the certificate. In my country, such wisdom keepers were highly honored. Your grandmother bridged old knowledge and new understanding. The locket held one more secret, a tiny painted portrait. Hannah Collins gazed out with the same quiet strength Sarah saw in her own mirror, her hands holding a book, much like the journal Sarah had inherited. 3 generations of healing wisdom, persisting despite fear and suspicion. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the study window, they saw the territorial governor arriving with his entourage, and, with them, faces Sarah recognized. Families who'd left River's Edge under shadows of suspicion now returned as respected witnesses. Among them walked Mary Wilson, the sheriff's daughter, carrying a small bouquet of healing herbs. "Perfect timing," James said, checking his watch, with a slight smile. "The governor's investigators need to see this. Your grandmother's certificate proves these traditions have been recognized by medical authorities for generations." "Not just mine," Sarah answered, thinking quickly. "Mrs. Chen, your family's scrolls. The governor should see how different healing traditions share common ground, and Margaret's medical kit." "Yes," James touched the ring on his chain. "Let them see how 3 traditions of wisdom came together at Silver Creek, not by chance, but by choice." Sarah gathered the documents. Her grandmother's certificate, Mrs. Chen's scrolls, Margaret's carefully preserved notes. Together they told a story not of witchcraft, but of women's wisdom preserved through generations. Knowledge that had saved lives, built bridges between cultures, and now would help heal a community poisoned by fear. Mrs. Crawford, a ranch hand, appeared at the door. "Governor's asking for you. And ma'am, Reverend Blake's wife is with them, says she needs to speak with you, urgent-like, something about her sister's difficult pregnancy." Sarah felt James's supportive hand on her back as she gathered her grandmother's journal and locket. Even now, with accusations still hanging over her, they sought her healing knowledge. Perhaps that was the greatest vindication, that need for healing proved stronger than fear. "Sarah," James said quietly as she turned to leave, "your grandmother would be proud. You've done more than preserve her knowledge. You've created a place where wisdom can grow." She touched the watch at her throat, its steady ticking matching her determined heart, with the locket's proof warm. In her hands and allies at her side, she walked out to meet the governor. It was time to show River's Edge that true healing began with facing truth. In the lamplight of James's study, the battle plans spread across his desk told a story of strategy and salvation. Not military tactics, but carefully crafted documents, witness statements, and property records, weapons of truth against long-festering corruption. Sarah watched as James marked another point on his map of River's Edge, each notation representing a family affected by Foster and Blake's persecution. "The Martinez family lost their farm here," he said, touching a spot near the river. "Blake accused them of pagan practices. They were Catholic. Foster called in their loan the next week." His finger moved to another mark. "The Chens lost their laundry business after treating injuries with traditional medicine. And here, the Williams place, seized when they spoke against the church's new building fund." Sarah added her own markers, green for families she'd treated, blue for children withdrawn from her school. The pattern emerged like a web of fear spanning the town, with the bank and church at its center. "They're gathering in town tonight," Sheriff Wilson reported from the doorway. He'd spent the day riding between Silver Creek and River's Edge, monitoring the opposition's movements. "Blake's called a special service. Foster's there too, burning records from what we can tell." "Let them burn," James said calmly, touching the careful copies spread before him. "We have everything we need here. Governor Harrison's seen the evidence, spent 3 hours reviewing it this afternoon. Wilson's badge, newly polished, caught the lamplight. Never seen him so angry. Says it's the worst case of organized persecution he's encountered in the territory." Sarah studied the map, remembering faces, names, lives disrupted by manufactured fear. "How many will come tomorrow?" "All of them," Wilson answered softly. "Every family that was driven out. The governor's offered protection and transportation. They're gathering at Miller's old place east of town. By sunrise, they'll be ready to testify." James checked his watch. Sarah's grandmother's watch now, since she wore his. "Miguel reports 30 riders from Blake's congregation watching our boundaries. They're expecting us to bring the governor into town with just a small escort." But that's not the plan, Sarah said, touching a detailed timeline James had drawn up. No. His smile held grim satisfaction. While they watched the main road, Sheriff Wilson's deputies will be escorting the displaced families back into town through the old logging trails. By the time Blake realizes what's happening, he'll face not just legal authorities, but the very people he wronged. Mrs. Chen entered with a tray of tea and her special strengthening brew. Cook has prepared food for 100 people tomorrow, she reported. All healing supplies are packed. Many will need care. Some have traveled far. Sarah thought of the families returning, carrying years of wounds, both physical and spiritual. We'll set up a healing station in the schoolhouse. It's fitting. That place should be about learning and healing again. Blake won't go quietly. Wilson warned. He's been preaching about divine punishment, stirring up the fearful ones. Foster's convinced some folks they'll lose everything if the bank changes hands. They're half right, James said, adding another notation to his timeline. They will lose everything, their power over others, their ability to use fear as a weapon. But the bank will be restored to legitimate operation. I've already arranged fair refinancing for any foreclosed properties. Sarah felt the weight of tomorrow pressing close. What about the children? Some will be facing parents who persecuted their friends, teachers who supported the accusations. That's why you're so important tomorrow, James said quietly. Not just as a witness, but as a healer. These people need more than justice. They need to see that knowledge and compassion are stronger than fear. Mrs. Chen laid out 3 objects. On the desk, Sarah's grandmother's journal, her own family's scrolls, and Margaret's medical kit. 3 traditions, same truth. Show them tomorrow. Through the study window, Sarah could see torches moving on distant hills. Blake's watchers, keeping their vigil, but inside Silver Creek's boundaries, other lights glowed. Lanterns marked where returning families were already gathering in outlying buildings. Ranch hands stood guard at regular intervals, and the governor's staff worked late preparing official documents. There's something else we need to consider, James said, pulling out a final paper. After tomorrow, River's Edge will need new leadership. The governor's offering to appoint an interim council to oversee the transition. He met Sarah's eyes. He'd like you to serve as head of the Education and Health Committee. Sarah's hand went to his watch, feeling its steady ticking against her palm. They'll resist having a woman in authority. At first, James agreed. But you'll have support. Sheriff Wilson's deputies, legitimate bank oversight, and he smiled slightly. A rather wealthy and influential husband. Not just a husband, she corrected, touching Thomas's ring where it hung beside James's own. Watch. A partner. In all things. Wilson cleared his throat. Sun's coming up in 9 hours. Blake's called another prayer meeting at dawn. That's when they'll realize the governor's not coming by the main road. James nodded, checking the timeline 1. Last time. Sarah, are you ready for what tomorrow brings? Once this starts, there's no turning back. River's Edge will never be the same. She looked at the battle plans spread before them. Not maps for war, but blueprints for reconstruction. Property deeds to be restored. Medical services to be established, education to be reformed, a chance to build something new from the ashes of fear. I've been ready since the day they tried to drown me, she said firmly. But now I understand what we're really fighting for. Not just justice, but healing, the kind that comes from facing truth and choosing to grow. Mrs. Chen began gathering empty teacups. In my country, they say medicine is not just for body, is for spirit too. Tomorrow, we heal both. Outside, the night deepened toward dawn. Sarah and James worked steadily, finalizing documents and preparations. Wilson rode out to coordinate with his deputies. Mrs. Chen supervised the organization of supplies and medicines. Throughout Silver Creek Ranch, people moved with quiet purpose, each playing their part in the coming restoration. Near midnight, James found Sarah in the herb garden, gathering fresh plants by lantern light. Together, they stood in the peaceful darkness, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and change, but tonight They drew strength from each other and the truth they served. "Whatever happens," James said softly, "we face it together." Sarah touched the watch at her throat, feeling its steady rhythm. "Like time itself," she answered, "moving forward, bringing change, but always connected to what matters most." In James's study, the battle plans lay ready, not for destruction but for rebirth. Dawn would bring a new chapter for River's Edge, written not in fear but in hope, guided by the steady hands of those who understood that true strength lay in wisdom shared, and justice tempered with compassion. Dawn broke over River's Edge with gunfire. The first shot came from the church tower, where Reverend Blake's eldest son had been posted as lookout. It was a warning shot, fired when he spotted not the expected small governor's party on the main road, but dozens of familiar faces emerging from the morning mist, families returning to reclaim their homes and truth. The second shot was aimed at James Crawford, standing tall in his black coat on the steps of Foster's Bank. The bullet struck the silver watch in his vest pocket, the one Sarah had returned to him for luck this morning, while she wore his grandmother's timepiece. The impact shattered the watch's crystal and stopped its hands at precisely 6:47 a.m., but saved his life. "Is this how men of God behave?" James's voice carried across the town square, steady despite the near miss. "Shooting at unarmed people returning to their homes." Sarah, positioned in the schoolhouse with Mrs. Chen and their medical supplies, felt her heart stop at the shot, but James remained standing, one hand pressed to the broken watch, the other raised to show he carried no weapon. "They're not welcome here." Blake emerged from the church, rifle in hand. "These people were cast out for their sins, their dark practices and foreign ways." Foreign ways. The new voice came from Dr. Harrison, the governor's personal physician, stepping forward from among the returning families. "Like young Timothy Chen's mother using acupuncture to ease my wife's childbirth pain last year in the capital. The same skills you called witchcraft when she practiced them here." Mrs. Chen's hands tightened on her family's scrolls. Sarah touched her arm gently, offering silent support as more voices rose from the crowd. "Or my grandfather's arthritis remedy," Maria Martinez called out. "The one your wife secretly bought from me before you seized our farm." Foster appeared on the bank steps below James, his face mottled with rage. "This is illegal! Crawford's trying to destroy everything we've built." "Everything? You've stolen, you mean?" Sheriff Wilson stepped into view, his badge gleaming in the morning light. Behind him, deputies emerged from side streets, surrounding the square. "We have the real bank records, Foster. Every forced foreclosure, every manipulated loan. More." Familiar faces appeared through the mist, families who'd stayed in River's Edge, but whose children had been withdrawn from Sarah's school. They watched silently as their former neighbors returned, carrying proof of persecution and corruption. "The governor's seen everything," James announced, his voice carrying authority despite the pain he must have felt from the impact. "Bank records, witness statements, property deeds. River's Edge is under territorial investigation for organized persecution and fraud. Lies!" Blake raised his rifle again. "We protected this town from evil, from witchcraft and foreign corruption." "Like this evil?" Sarah stepped out of the schoolhouse, holding her grandmother's medical certificate high. Official recognition from the Boston Medical Society, dated 1823. Traditional healing practices documented and validated. Or this. She held up Mrs. Chen's scrolls, 8 generations of medical knowledge respected throughout California. And this. James drew out the broken watch, its crystal spiderwebbed, but its case dented by the bullet. A reminder, that time catches up to all lies eventually. That truth, like healing, cannot be stopped by force. The watching crowd stirred as more figures emerged from the mist. The governor's full retinue appeared at the edge of town, having circled around while Blake's watchers focused on the main road. With them came territorial marshals and, most significantly, the regional bank examiner. "Reverend Blake," Sarah called out, her voice clear in the tense silence. "Your granddaughter's fever still troubles her, doesn't it? The same fever you're a son's wife struggles with. She saw the flicker of fear cross his face, not of her, but for his family. Come to the schoolhouse after this is over. Bring them both. It's time for real healing to begin. The rifle in Blake's hands wavered. Behind him, his son climbed down from the church tower, looking uncertainly between his father and the returning families he'd grown up with. James held up the broken watch, its hands frozen at the moment of impact. Time to choose, Reverend. Continue this fight and face prosecution, or help us rebuild River's Edge as it should be, a place where different traditions and beliefs enrich rather than threaten. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the full circle of witnesses, justice, and hope surrounding the square. The confrontation's next moments would determine not just the town's future, but whether hatred or healing would triumph in the hearts of its people. The church bell that had once tolled to gather mobs now rang out across River's Edge with a different message. Its clear notes marked the moment Reverend Blake lowered his rifle, the metal clanging not in warning, but in surrender and hope. Chung. Timothy Blake, the Reverend's son, pulled the bell rope with tears streaming down his face, each peal washing away years of fear and hatred. My boy, Blake said hoarsely, looking up at the bell tower. He's been sick too, getting worse like his sister. The rifle dropped from nerveless fingers. All this time, we've been so afraid of evil that we couldn't recognize healing when it stood before us. Sarah stepped forward, James at her side. The broken watch in his pocket clinked against Thomas's ring as he moved. Your children aren't the only ones suffering, she said gently. How many in River's Edge have been denied care because of fear? Foster tried one last stand, brandishing papers from the bank's steps. The deeds are legal. We followed the law. Your kind of law. Sheriff Wilson's deputies moved in, their badges catching the morning light. Governor's seen the real records, Foster. Every forced sale, every manipulated mortgage. The bank examiner stepped forward, his official documents bearing territorial seals. Edward Foster, you're under investigation for fraud, corruption, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their legal rights. I suggest you surrender peacefully. The watching crowd stirred as Foster's shoulders sagged. Decades of power built on fear crumbled in the face of simple truth. Deputies led him away as the bell continued its cleansing song. Sarah, Blake's wife, emerged from the church, supporting their feverish daughter. Please, help them. The schoolhouse had been prepared for this moment. Mrs. Chen led the way, carrying her family's scrolls and healing herbs. Other families stepped forward. The Martinezes with their traditional remedies, the Chens with their acupuncture wisdom, all the knowledge that fear had once condemned, now offered freely. Ring the bell again, James called to young Timothy. Let everyone know that healing has returned to River's Edge. The bell's song drew more people from their homes. Children Sarah hadn't seen in months ran to hug their former teacher. Parents, who'd turned away in fear, now approached with questions about remedies and treatments. The square filled with reunions, tears, and tentative steps toward reconciliation. Governor Harrison mounted the church steps, his official presence lending weight to the transformation. River's Edge will have new leadership, he announced. A council representing all its people, all its traditions. Mrs. Crawford will head the Committee on Education and Healing Arts. Sarah felt James's proud smile as she addressed her neighbors. The schoolhouse will be more than a school now. We'll create a place of learning and healing where different traditions enrich each other. No more fear, no more persecution, just wisdom shared for the good of all. The morning sun broke fully through the mist as the bell rang out once more. Sarah saw Mrs. Chen helping Blake's wife prepare a traditional fever remedy, while Martinez's grandmother shared her knowledge of healing plants. The boundaries that fear had built began to dissolve in the face of shared concern and ancient wisdom. Time for a new beginning, James said softly, touching the broken watch that had saved his life. Though perhaps we need a more reliable timekeeper. Sarah smiled, reaching for his grandmother's watch that she still wore. Some things are worth more than keeping perfect time, like knowing when to stand firm and when to offer healing. The victory bell rang out across River's Edge, its song carrying to the furthest farms. With each peal, more people emerged from their homes, drawn to the square where healing and hope had triumphed over fear and persecution. Children played together regardless of background. Women shared remedies passed down through generations, and men who'd once threatened violence now worked together to repair the damage fear had caused. In the schoolhouse, Sarah and Mrs. Chen began treating Blake's children, their combined wisdom already easing the fever's grip. The Reverend watched with tears in his eyes as Chinese medicine and European herbs worked together, his previous condemnation transformed into grateful prayer. The bell continued its joyful song, rung now by many hands, former enemies becoming neighbors again, children celebrating the return of their friends, families reclaiming their place in the community. Its music spelled the end of fear's reign in River's Edge, and the beginning of something new, a community where different traditions and wisdom could flourish together, protected by justice and nurtured by understanding. James slipped his arm around Sarah's waist as they watched their victory unfold. "Listen," he said softly, "that's the sound of truth winning over fear." "No," she corrected gently, "that's the sound of healing beginning." The new sign above the schoolhouse door caught the autumn sunlight, its gold letters declaring, "River's Edge Academy of Healing Arts and Education, Sarah Crawford, Director." Below, in careful script, additional text read, "Traditional Wisdom, Modern Learning All Welcome." 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Chinese, welcomed visitors to what had become the heart of the transformed community. 6 months had passed since the morning of the victory bell. James stood beside Sarah now, both watching as Mrs. Chen led a class in traditional medicine, while Martinez's grandmother demonstrated herb preparation. Through the open windows came children's voices reciting lessons, mixed with the sounds of women sharing healing wisdom in multiple languages. Governor Harrison's report called it a model for territorial integration, James said proudly, his new watch, a gift from Sarah, keeping steady time in his pocket. The broken one that had saved his life was now displayed in the school's museum, alongside Sarah's grandmother's certificate and Mrs. Chen's family scrolls. "We're more than a model," Sarah replied, touching his grandmother's watch at her throat. "We're proof that fear only wins if we let it." She smiled as Blake's daughter ran past, fully recovered and carrying herbs for the afternoon's lessons. The Reverend himself now served on the town council, his sermons focusing on healing and unity rather than fear and division. Through the doorway, Sarah could see the changes 6 months had brought. The bank, under new management, offered fair terms to all residents. Sheriff Wilson's deputies included men and women from every community. The town square, once a place of confrontation, now hosted a weekly market where different traditions and remedies were shared freely. Silver Creek Ranch has changed too, James observed, watching ranch hands' children playing together in the schoolyard. More families settling, more traditions mixing. Cook says the kitchen's never been so interesting. Sarah laughed, remembering the morning's breakfast, traditional American biscuits served with Chinese tea and Mexican herbs. "We're all changing, growing." She touched the sign's golden letters. "But some things remain constant, like love," James said softly, drawing her close, "and truth." A crowd was gathering for the afternoon's public health clinic. Sarah saw former enemies sitting together, sharing remedies and stories. Foster's wife, her husband now serving time for his crimes, had become one of the academy's most dedicated. Students learning to heal rather than hurt. The victory bell, now rung only for celebration and classes, chimed the hour. Sarah prepared to return to her duties, but James held her back for a moment. "Look," he said, nodding toward the street where a wagon was arriving. "New families coming to learn, words spreading about River's Edge, not as a place of fear anymore, but as a center of healing and wisdom." Sarah watched the newcomers approach, saw hope in their eyes as they read the sign's welcoming words. She thought of that morning by the river, when hatred had nearly drowned wisdom. Now the same river nourished gardens, where healing plants from 3 continents grew together, its waters carrying away old fears and feeding new growth. "Time to begin the afternoon lessons," she said, straightening her shawl, a new one, embroidered with symbols of healing from many traditions. "There's always more to learn, more wisdom to share." "Always," James agreed, touching Thomas's ring where it hung beside his new watch. "And always more love to grow." Together they walked into their transformed schoolhouse, where fear had been replaced by understanding, and persecution had yielded to peace. The sign above caught the sun once more, its promise of welcome and wisdom shining like hope itself over the renewed heart of River's Edge.